Great. Okay, welcome everybody. So this is the third of our events in the Leuven seminar in classical German philosophy. I will just mention a few administrative things first. We're going to have a 40-minute talk this evening, followed by a short response. And then after that, we will open the session to a discussion. Please let me know if you want to ask a question by raising your hand by pressing the blue raise hand function in the chat. If you can't find that function, you can just write question in the chat. If you are happy to turn on your cameras, we'll be happy to see you, but that's not obligatory. And after the session, we'll leave the Zoom meeting open so that people can chat informally if they wish. So I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Sonja Schierbaum. She leads the Emma Noether Research Group, Practical Reasons Before Kant, 1720 to 1780, which is at the Universities of Würzburg and the ETH Halle. I've noticed that they are currently advertising for a doctoral researcher.
Yes.
With a deadline that's upcoming very soon, so do apply for that if you're interested. Prior to her current position, she had a DFG project at Hamburg on action and the principle of sufficient reason in Leibniz and Crusius. She has published widely in medieval and early modern philosophy, including her book, Occam's Assumption of Mental Speech, Thinking in a World of Particulars, with Brill in 2014. And her paper this evening is entitled Wolff and Crusius on the Human Mind and its Distinctive Feature, Reason or Consciousness.
Yeah. So thank you very much for the introduction. And thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have the occasion to discuss this ongoing research of mine with you. And we're looking forward to the discussion. I have a PowerPoint presentation just with the quotations, because there are quite a lot of quotations. And yes. Okay, so I simply start now. So in this paper, I present Christian Wolff's conception of the mind and that of his most important contemporary opponent, Christian August Crusius. The two German philosophers agree that free action is specific to human agents, although they strongly disagree on what it means to act freely. Wolff considers freedom to be a kind of rational self-determination, since we necessarily choose what we conceive to be best. Crusius, by contrast, rejects this view. He's committed to the voluntarist conception of freedom as the power to act otherwise in any situation. They also agree, however, that free action presupposes both cognitive and appetitive aspects of the mind. But here in this talk, I focus on the cognitive aspect. And my aim is to show that Crusius and Wolff hold opposing views with respect to the distinctive cognitive features of the mind that are presupposed by free action, namely consciousness and reason. To be sure, they agree that free action presupposes both. However, they disagree on the exact relationship between these features. I argue that for Crusius, consciousness is specific to humans insofar as reason is necessary but not sufficient for free action. Whereas for Wolff, consciousness is necessary but not sufficient. And I argue further that Crusius conceives of consciousness as a higher order cognition of one's mental acts, whereas for Wolff, thinking in general implies consciousness. So I proceed as follows. I first discuss the two conceptions of the mind, and then I discuss the two accounts of consciousness. And against this backdrop, I determine the relationship between the cognitive features required for free action. So first to the conception and classification of minds. So two things should become clear. First, Crusius' concept of mind is broader than Wolff's, insofar as it also applies to non-human agents, non-human animals. Second, The distinctive feature of the human mind is not reason in general, but consciousness. According to Crusius, non-human and human minds have the same nature, since they have the same powers of reason and will. Wolff denies this. In his view, human and non-human beings do not have the same nature, since their powers are too different. Accordingly, only human beings have minds, whereas animals do not. Therefore, the distinctive feature of the mind is reason, not consciousness. So it should become clear that for Wolff, consciousness is common to human and non-human animals. Now, Crusius' concept of mind is broader because it implies broader concepts of its two distinctive powers. As a consequence, the distinctive feature of the human mind is not reason, since reason, at least in the broad sense, is common to human and non-human minds alike. To see this, it's helpful to take a look at this general explanation of mind. So a mind is a substance that is able to represent things and to act according to its representations. In Crusius' own words, this is the, I quote, the general nature common to all substances able to represent things and to act according to their representations. As Crusius emphasizes, animals and humans share the general nature of minds. They are different species insofar as the general nature of minds is determined in different ways. Species of minds are determined by the nature of their power to represent things, that is understanding, and to act according to the representations, that is will. So the general unspecific activity of thinking can be explicated as follows. To think in a broad sense just means to have ideas. As generally speaking, understanding as the power to think is the power of a mind to have ideas. A mind can have ideas if it can perceive things. Crusius explicitly states that the power of sensation or perception, that is Empfindung in German, is the most fundamental power of understanding. So when a person has a sensation or perception of thinking, so in this talk, I just use these terms interchangeably, sensation and perception. Okay, so when a person has a sensation of something, then she's forced to take the object of her sensation as present and existing. As a consequence, it's not possible to arrive at a sensation by inference or deduction from other representations. This is why sensation is the most fundamental power of understanding. Its acts do not presuppose any acts of any other power. Also, it's not possible to reveal sensations as illusory at a later time. Now, there are two kinds of sensations, namely external and internal, distinguished by the kind of object that is represented. So external sensation is sense perception, involving the five senses. It's common to human agents and animals. Now, internal sensation is restricted to human agents, since it is the power of consciousness. Sorry. So this is the first quote. So inner sensation is the power by means of which you perceive something that we represent as being inside our soul. Inner sensation is the power of consciousness. Partly we perceive that we are thinking by means of inner sensation. Partly we sense the parts, quality, and relations of our concepts. Partly we also sense certain activities and states of our will. Now, according to Crusius, we are conscious of our acts of thinking and willing when we use the power of inner sensation. It's only when we use this power that we become conscious of the mental state by means of a neither higher order act or state. So non-human animals do not need to be conscious of their representations nor of themselves in order to be able to act according to their representations. So that was the explication of what a mind is. Okay. Suppose, for instance, that a fox smells and sees a rabbit. So rabbits happen to be the possible objects of a natural desire of foxes, namely to eat in order to sustain themselves. Therefore, the perception of a rabbit is sufficient to determine the fox to chase a rabbit in order to catch and eat it. So the cognition of objects of desires are only efficient causes of the actions of animals. This is why animals are determined by the cognition of the objects of their desires. Still, they act according to their ideas. Only they do not act freely, since they cannot choose. Animals do not have the power of freedom, which is the power to choose which of one's prevailing desires to adopt as action guiding. This choice, however, presupposes consciousness, insofar as one has to be conscious of one's desires in order to adopt one of them as action guiding. Crusius is well aware that his conception of a mind is broader in scope than other traditional conceptions, because his conceptions of the two powers of the minds is broader. He states, I, however, contrary to common approaches, widen the concepts of mind, will, and of thought. According to others, thinking comprises only representation involving abstract concepts. Also, for them, the will, which they set against sensual desires, is only the power to act according to abstract concepts. And they call minds only those substances that know the truth with consciousness and distinct discrimination. So, although Crusius does not mention explicitly it here, a target of his criticism is Wolff's rival conception. According to Wolff, a mind is an entity that has the powers of the understanding, so Verstand, and free will. And that excludes non-human animals in two respects. Animals lack understanding, and therefore they also lack the power of free will, since free will in the strict sense presupposes understanding. Now, first to the lack of understanding. Animals only have the lower cognitive powers of sense perception and imagination, and the lower appetitive power of sensual desire. So Wolff uses the terms human soul and mind interchangeably, since all human souls are minds due to their power of understanding. And Wolff defines understanding as the power of distinct cognition. So the lower cognitive powers differ from understanding in that if a person only perceives something without using her understanding, then this perception can only be clear, but never distinct. A cognition of a thing is merely clear, but not distinct, if it's sufficient to distinguish the thing from other things. Whereas a cognition is not merely clear, but also distinct, if it's sufficient to also distinguish between the parts of the thing or of the corresponding concept. In this sense, distinct cognition presupposes clear cognition. So distinct cognition, as the power of understanding, is further described as the ability to know what the difference between things exactly is, as opposed to clear cognition, which can also be described as the ability to recognize that things are different, but without the ability to tell what the difference exactly is. If, for instance, a person, say a child, only has a clear cognition of two geometrical shapes, say, such as a triangle and a square, she's able to distinguish the triangle from the square, but she's not able to tell what exactly the difference between them is. So what is crucial is that clear cognition implies consciousness, insofar as for Wolff, to think is nothing but to be conscious. He calls a thought the action of the soul by which we are conscious. And he further observes that it's common to say that one does not think of anything if one is not conscious of anything. So in this respect, Wolff is close to John Locke, who holds that, I quote, consciousness is the perception of what passes in a man's own mind. And that is sometimes called the transparency view of the mind. Gary Hadfield puts it as follows. So the mind is fully transparent. If it has a thought or sensation or other mental state, it knows it. And Wolff suggests that consciousness is the very distinctive feature of thinking. We know that we're thinking by being conscious. So in what follows, it should become clear that although on the one hand, Wolff admits that non-human animals are also conscious, non-human animals differ in nature from human beings. So to start with the difference in nature, although human beings and non-human animals both have the power of clear cognition, their powers differ to such a degree so as to constitute a difference in nature. So Wolff has an argument which can be rendered as follows. So the power of representation constitutes the essence and nature of the human soul. Non-human animals have a power of representation. Therefore, this power of representation constitutes the essence and nature of the animal soul. The human power of representation is of a higher degree of clarity than the non-human power. But powers of the same kind can differ only with respect to their degree. Therefore, the essence and nature of the human soul is different from the essence and nature of the non-human soul. Well, it seems inconsistent that on the one hand, human and non-human beings have the same kind of power, but on the other, that the difference in degree of clarity is such that the nature of humans is different from the nature of non-humans. But Wolff attempts to justify his argument by pointing out that the degree of clear cognition that is required for distinct cognition changes the whole power of representation, since this degree brings distinctness in particular sensations and makes the soul capable of a general knowledge of things, on which no animal is capable of reaching, end of quote. So his point is that distinct cognition is different in quality from clear cognition, in that the ability to acquire knowledge presupposes distinct cognition, whereas the ability to just to discriminate things only presupposes clear cognition. Now, it could be contested whether Wolff's argumentation is conclusive, but what matters in the present context is that the understanding as the power of distinct cognition is the distinctive feature of humans, insofar as the natures of humans and non-human animals differ with respect to this very power. Now, second, to the lack of freedom. The lack of understanding is crucial insofar as understanding is a presupposition of free will in the strict sense. So negatively speaking, to be free means to be independent of sensory perception as the basis of one's willing. But positively, freedom is the ability of a person to choose among all the options available to her, the one she conceives to be best. But choices are consistent with a principle of sufficient reason. That is, we always choose what we conceive to be best. Still, Wolff calls this kind of determination free insofar as the determining principle is not alien or external to the mind, but quite the contrary, is the mind's very own principle. His idea is that freedom is nothing but rational self-determination. We rationally determine ourselves if our volition is determined by our clear and distinct cognition of the quality of things, since the power of clear and distinct cognition is the very nature of our mind. Therefore, only humans have minds insofar only as only humans can determine themselves. And non-human animals, by contrast, are determined by their sensory cognition and their sensory desires. So Crusius and Wolff agree at least on that very aspect, in this aspect. So what humans and non-humans have in common, in Wolff's view, is that they can be conscious. The point is that consciousness, or being conscious of something, including oneself, only presupposes clear cognition. And clear cognition requires nothing more than sense perception. Wolff explicitly concedes that animals and humans have sense organs similar in kind. Therefore, their perceptions must be similar. And he concludes, I quote, "Therefore, animals are conscious of themselves and of that which they perceive." End of quote. That an animal is conscious of itself and of what it perceives means that an animal knows that it sees or hears or feels, etc. And that matches Wolff's explication of clear thoughts, since a thought is clear if we know what we think and are able to distinguish it from other thoughts. I now want to show that according to Crusius' conception, consciousness is distinctive of human beings. For Crusius, it's not the case that whenever there are cognitive states such as perceptions, there's also consciousness. Consciousness requires more than simple cognition. So, okay, understanding is nothing but the power to represent things, but its perfection is the power to know the truth, that is reason, Vernunft, also Vernunft as opposed to Verstand. Wolff agrees that knowing the truth is distinctive of reason. For Crusius, the power to know the truth necessarily involves consciousness. I quote, "The degrees of reason's perfection can be manifold. An understanding that has sufficient power to know the truth with consciousness is called reason." Now, knowing the truth not only involves, but presupposes consciousness. And since consciousness is a distinct power, namely the power of inner sensation, it follows that the use of reason as the power to know the truth presupposes the power of consciousness. Thus, the understanding admits of the highest degree of perfection only with respect to humans. To have ideas is necessary, but not sufficient. It's further required that the mind be conscious of its ideas. And consciousness is required in yet another respect, namely as a presupposition of the power of abstraction. The power of abstraction is also required by reason as a power to know the truth. A person uses her power of abstraction if she analyzes her concepts by distinguishing between their parts. So Crusius writes, "It is the power to distinguish between ideas and between their conceptual parts. To distinguish means, roughly, to be conscious of the distinction between two things, but consciousness occurs by means of inner sensation. In order to analyze one's concepts, that is, to distinguish between their constitutive parts, it's necessary to be conscious of them. As Crusius puts it, we are not conscious of things because we distinguish between them. Rather, we can distinguish between them in the first place because we are conscious. Consciousness by nature is prior to making distinctions, and it is one of the efficient causes of making distinctions." So note that the view Crusius rejects in the very first line, we are not conscious of things because we distinguish between them, can be ascribed to Wolff. If a person distinguishes a thing from other things by perceiving it, she's conscious of the thing. That was the very explication of a clear cognition. As Wolff puts it, accordingly, we find that we are conscious of things when we distinguish between them. By contrast, if we do not notice the difference between things that are present to us, then we are not conscious of what we might look at. End of quote. In the latter case, our cognition is obscure. For Wolff, an obscure cognition is not conscious in the following sense. If a person does not distinguish between two things, then she is not conscious of the two things. So it's interesting that Wolff marks the difference between being conscious and not being conscious by means of discrimination of what is cognized, including consciousness of oneself. The point is that if we are conscious of other things, then we become also conscious of the difference between these other things and ourselves, namely by taking the action of distinguishing as an operation of our soul. So it's by means of this activity of the soul that we distinguish our soul from the things that the soul is representing and distinguishing. By contrast, for Crusius, consciousness, as the power of inner sensation, is a distinct basic power. Non-human animals are unable to know the truth because they lack the power of consciousness, not because they lack the power of understanding. Okay, so my aim in this section was to show that Crusius' conception of mind is broader than Wolff's. It includes non-human and human minds alike as substances that are able to represent things and to act according to their representations. Crusius' conception of mind is broader because the concepts of the understanding in the world are broader. It follows from Crusius' conception of the power of representation that the most basic distinctive feature of the human mind is consciousness. By contrast, for Wolff, understanding as the power of distinct cognition and its perfection, reason, is distinctive of human beings, not consciousness. So much for the mind. Now we come to the account of consciousness. Oh yeah. So, okay, consciousness. Yes, this is very long. I'm sorry. This is very long. Okay, so Crusius, here's an example. Crusius illustrates the distinction between cognizing an object and being conscious of one's cognition of the object by way of an example. So this is the example. Further, Consciousness deserves much attention, in particular, since thereby something is added to the action, that is the cognitive act, by means of which an object is represented, which is not contained in the representation of the object at all. We have an idea of our thoughts themselves by means of consciousness, just as the sun itself is not the same as the representation of the sun. So the representation of the sun, that is the action, by means of which the sun is conceived, cannot be the same as the representation of that action. Since the sun is the object of the idea of the sun, just as regarding consciousness, the idea of the sun is the object of that idea, by means of which the idea of the sun is represented and conceived of. Therefore, one should concede that consciousness requires a particular basic power by means of which it's possible. So here Crusius clearly draws a distinction between the two mental states or acts, namely of cognizing a thing and of being conscious of one's state of cognizing a thing. And these two states require different things. To begin with, they have different objects, namely in one case the sun, and in the other the idea of the sun. And Crusius calls cognitive states actions of the mind, insofar as they are actualizations of the corresponding cognitive power. So to have an idea of the sun only requires external perception, whereas to have an idea of one's idea of the sun requires internal perception, that is consciousness. That is, if a person perceives the sun, then the sun is the object of her act of perception. And if a person is conscious of a perception of the sun, then her act of perceiving the sun is the object of a higher order act, by means of which she is conscious of her act of perceiving the sun. So Crusius commits himself to the view that we are conscious of our cognitive act only if it becomes the object of yet another higher order act, because he seems to think that this is implied by the distinction between the act as the mental vehicle of representation and what it represents, its representation content, that is, its object. And in Crusius' view, this also shows that it's necessary to posit consciousness as a distinct power, since the mere power of representing things is not sufficient to explain how cognitive states, as the vehicle of representation, can become themselves the objects of representation. Thus, Crusius committed to a higher order account of consciousness. That is, he reserves the term consciousness and its cognates to the higher order activity of representing one's mental acts. Wolff, by contrast, does not see the need to explicitly distinguish a distinct power to explain consciousness of one's mental acts. But the situation is less clear than it might appear at first view. Earlier, we saw that consciousness of one's mental acts is implied by the mental operation of distinguishing between things, including oneself. But it's far from clear whether consciousness of one's act implies a high order act, since Wolff does not address that issue. And the problem is that my presentation so far was based on his German metaphysics. And what complicates the matter is that both in his later Psychologia Rationalis and his Psychologia Empirica, Wolff explicitly distinguishes between perception and apperception, and thus between first order and second order cognition. So in the Psychologia Empirica, he explicates perception as follows. The mind is said to perceive when it represents itself some object. Then the perception is indeed an act of the mind by means of which it represents itself an object. In this manner, we perceive colors, odors, sounds, and the mind perceives itself and the contingent changes that occur in it. So in the very next paragraph, he explicates apperception. Now, apperception is attributed to the mind insofar as it is conscious of its perception. The name apperception is used by Leibniz. Apperception, however, coincides for him with consciousness. So first to perception. That a person perceives a thing means that she represents it by means of an act of perception. For instance, that Peter sees the sun means that he is representing the sun to himself. by his act of seeing. Yeah, the act of seeing is the means or vehicle of representation, whereas the sun is the object of the act of seeing. Of course, seeing is a first order act. Strikingly, however, Wolff goes on to say that a person can also perceive herself and the contingent changes that occur in her. And these changes pertain to the person's mental acts. So Wolff basically distinguishes between things that can persist for themselves and things that can only persist by means of others. So the former substances and the other accidents. And you know, the acts of the mind, of thinking, he also calls actualizations or restrictions, Einschränkung. Now, if an act of, say, representing the sun ceases to be, and another act of, say, representing the trees occurs, this can adequately be described as a transition or shift, Abwechslung, from one sort of restriction of the mind's power to another, namely from the sun representing kind to the trees representing kind. This, however, raises a question. According to Wolff's own explication, that a person perceives something means that she represents it to herself by means of an act of perception. Thus, if a person is said to perceive the succession of her acts, then this seems to imply that she represents the succession of her acts by means of an act of perception. The act of representing the succession, however, should be different from the succeeding acts themselves. The problem is that the act of perception is the means of representation. Thus, it is difficult to see how the means of representation can be represented itself without yet another act. And remember, that was Crusius' reason for positing inner sensation as the power of consciousness, as a separate power. Another problem is that if Wolff were to posit another act for the perception of one's acts, then perception and apperception would be indistinguishable, since apperception just is the grasp of one's first order acts by means of second order acts. So if the distinction between perception and apperception is to be intelligible, Wolff should restrict perception to first order acts. Now, with respect to apperception, Wolff is in line with Leibniz. Leibniz explicates apperception in contrast to perception. So perception for Leibniz is, I quote, the monad's inner state of representing the external things, whereas apperception is the reflexive cognition of this inner state. And in his Psychologia Rationalis, Wolff picks up on Leibniz's characterization of apperception when he explicates that when the soul is conscious of itself and the things that it perceives, then it reflects upon its total perception, end of quote. So the point is that if a person is conscious of her perception, she apperceives her perception. Thus, to apperceive one's act means to reflect upon it. And as Wolff rightly remarks in the quote, for Leibniz, apperception coincides with consciousness. Thus, it appears that Crusius, against Wolff, agrees with Leibniz in the restriction of consciousness to higher order cognition. The question, therefore, is what it should mean to perceive one's act by means of a first order act. So here's another example. Wolff writes, since we are thinking, when we are conscious of those things that come to pass in us, and that we represent to us as external to us, every thought involves perception as well as apperception. For example, while I am now writing, I'm conscious that I write. Insofar as I'm conscious of the act of writing, I apperceive the act. But insofar as the same act is represented in the mind, to the effect that I could be conscious of it, I perceive the very same act. The act of writing is not perceived insofar as certain motions of the hand and fingers that are necessary for the conduct and order of the letters occur. End of quote. Wolff's claim seems to be that the act of representing the act of writing, which is the vehicle of representation in the first place, is also represented in the mind. This representation, however, seems to be merely potential as long as it pertains to the level of first order acts, namely insofar as one can become conscious of the act. To perceive the act by a first order act alone just means to be able to become conscious of it by reflecting upon it. So it's clear that the perception of the act of writing is not the perception of the content of the act of writing. That is, of what is represented by perceiving the movement of the hand and fingers holding the pen, etc. So Wolff is very explicit about this at the end of the quote here. So perhaps this is Wolff's version of the transparency view of the mind. Since the mind is the power to represent things by its acts, anything that occurs in the mind must also be able to be represented, since the mind just is the power to represent. Thus, if an act occurs in the mind, the act must be able to be represented. And it seems plausible to say that the act is in fact represented if the person is conscious of her act by apperceiving the act. Wolff stresses that any thought involves perception as well as apperception. So he seems to hold the view that whenever we represent things to us, we are also conscious of our representing things. Now, Crusius would deny this. His point is that we are not always conscious of our mental states, but only if we use our power of internal sensation. There are two conditions for consciousness. So a person becomes conscious of a cognitive act of representing a thing if the representation of the thing is sufficiently vivid, and if, second, there is a sufficient mobility of the materials surrounding the soul. Now, as to the second condition, Crusius here argues against Leibniz this time that mind and body do interact. There's no pre-established harmony between them. Thus, there's a material condition for perception in general and for inner sensation in particular. But more important for us is the first condition, the degree of vivacity of the representation. Now, vivacity is nothing but the degree of intensity of a force or power in its actual operation. It does not concern the very content of a cognitive act, but rather the manner or mode of the representation of how the content is represented. What I have in mind here can be illustrated by way of analogy. If, for instance, your favorite song is on the radio, you can first play it at top volume and then turn the volume down if, for instance, a neighbor complains. But the difference in loudness does not imply any difference as to what is played, namely your favorite song. More generally, the idea is that the mere difference in the vivacity of a representation does not imply a difference as to the content represented. So the point is that a first order act that is sufficiently vivid causes an act of inner sensation. And Crusius holds that in general, every representation brings consciousness with it if it has a certain degree of vivacity. And it should be noted that Crusius' vivacity is not the same as Wolff's clarity and distinctness. The point is that clarity and distinctness concern the content of the representation, not its mode or manner. It is adequate to distinguish between a true and a false distinctness with respect to the content of a representation due to the possibility of misrepresentation. But no such distinction applies to the vivacity of an idea, simply because it does not concern the idea's content. So the difference can be illustrated. Although Wolff explicitly distinguished between perception and apperception only in his Latin works, he's committed to the view that we are conscious of things by distinguishing between them throughout his works. Now, in the following case, the person is not able to distinguish the parts of a thing and therefore only has an obscure cognition of that thing. He writes, by contrast, if we do not know what to make of what we think, then our thoughts are obscure. For example, I see something white from afar in the fields, but I do not know what to make of it, since I cannot distinguish any parts of it. Then the thought I have of it is obscure, end of quote. Now, Wolff could say that in this case, a person is conscious of that thing insofar as she can at least distinguish it from other things such as the fields, etc., even though she might not be able to distinguish between the parts of the white thing. The point is that a lack of clarity implies a lack of consciousness. The lesser I'm able to distinguish a thing from another thing, the less I am conscious of a thing. So the degree of consciousness seems to be nothing but the degree of clarity and distinctness of the cognition. By contrast, Crusius can argue that the cognition of a white thing can be sufficiently vivid so as to cause the person to become conscious of her seeing a white thing, whether she knows what it is that she's seeing or not. That is, even a perception that is obscure in this sense can be of a high degree of intensity, vivacity. Crusius notes that perceptions or sensory ideas have the highest degree of vivacity. Accordingly, it's not the lack of clarity and distinctness that accounts for lack of consciousness in Crusius' view, but rather a lack of vivacity of one's first order cognition. So vivacity on the one hand and clarity and distinctness on the other are not the same. Therefore, the conditions for being conscious of one's cognition are also not the same. Since for Wolff, a cognition's being sufficiently clear is sufficient for being conscious of it, whereas for Crusius, a cognition's being sufficiently vivid is sufficient for becoming conscious of it by inner sensation. Put differently, according to Wolff, we always perceive things as distinct from ourselves. Therefore, whenever we perceive things clearly, we are also conscious of our perceiving them. By contrast, Crusius thinks that we become conscious of our cognition only if it's of a sufficient degree of vivacity or intensity. This, however, does not by itself imply that we could not perceive things without being conscious of our perceiving. Animals cannot be conscious of their perceptions, but they can surely be said to perceive things. So I now come to the conclusion, or am I too late already? Another minute?
You're fine.
Okay, conclusion. Now, Crusius is committed to a higher order account of consciousness. He reserves the term consciousness to higher order cognition of one's mental acts. By contrast, Wolff does not restrict consciousness to higher order cognition of one's acts. This is only the specific case of apperception. In general, he takes consciousness to be a matter of discrimination. To be conscious of a thing and of oneself implies to distinguish it from other things, including one's own act. Clear cognition is sufficient for consciousness of things and of oneself. Also, Wolff explicitly holds that animals are conscious of things and of themselves insofar as they can distinguish between themselves and the things they perceive. In his Psychologia Rationalis, he explicitly states that apperception as consciousness of one's acts is therefore also to be ascribed to non-human animals. Only their apperception is restricted to acts of the lower cognitive powers. Wolff emphasizes that apperception is not sufficient for having a mind. What is further required is a power of understanding, with reason as its possible degree of perfection. Crucially, distinct cognition is the presupposition of free will, since a person determines herself only if her will is determined by her distinct cognition of the quality of things. Freedom for Wolff, again, is nothing but the mind's rational self-determination. Crusius, of course, would deny this. For him, freedom is the adoption of one of the person's prevailing desires. This choice is not determined in any way. What matters is that this adoption presupposes consciousness, insofar as the person has to be conscious of her desires, since it is only when she's conscious of her desires that she can distinguish between them and thus choose among them. In the end, then, it should have become clear that clear and distinct cognition is distinctive of the human mind for Wolff, whereas for Crusius, consciousness is. What makes them distinctive is that there are crucial presuppositions of free action. Thus, it should also be clear how Crusius and Wolff's accounts of the mind differ with respect to the conception of its cognitive aspect. But more investigation is needed to determine whether and how this difference follows from their different conceptions of the will and its freedom. Thank you very much for your attention. I stop this now. Oof, thank you very much. I'm sorry it was quite long, but yeah.
No, it was perfectly to time.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Sonja. And I will turn immediately to our respondent, who is Dr. Andre Harmon. He is a research fellow at the University of Siegen. He has published on both ancient and modern philosophy. His book, Kritische Metaphysik der Substanz, Kant im Widerspruch zu Leibniz, came out with De Gruyter in 2009. And in 2016, he published a systematic commentary on Aristotle's De Anima with Reclam. So Andre, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Let me just note very briefly that you might find it strange that I say Dr. Schierbaum. I'm not saying that because I'm rude or because I don't like the paper. To the contrary, I like it very much. It's just because I'm German, and that's maybe with our nature, and we are rude by nature, but that's another point. Okay, so the starting point, so Dr. Schierbaum's starting point is the question of freedom of action in Crusius and Wolff. Despite some important similarities, Crusius and Wolff differ in their understanding of what it means to be free. It is well known that the problem of free will was central to the early reception of Wolff's philosophy. In fact, Crusius played a major role due to his criticism of Wolff's alleged proof of the principle of sufficient reason. However, Dr. Schierbaum does not address the historical debate surrounding the principle of sufficient reason. She has chosen a different approach to this problem and focused on the cognitive features of the mind that are presupposed by free action. Her major aim is to show that both philosophers hold opposing views with regard to these features. This approach is original, interesting, and sheds new light on some neglected connections between Wolff's and Crusius' psychology of action. However, as I will argue in the following, the discussion would gain from taking into account also Crusius' criticism of the principle of sufficient reason. And I know she is a real expert in this matter, which makes me wonder why she decided to neglect this issue. I mean, she might also change the focus completely and not talk about free action at all, but about consciousness simpliciter. Yeah. I will come back to this later. Before, I need to address some of her claims from the second and third part of the talk. Dr. Schierbaum demonstrates that Crusius' conception of the mind is broader than Wolff's, since it also includes animal minds. What is unique to the human mind, however, is consciousness. Also, this is true. I don't think Dr. Schierbaum is correct to claim that, I quote, non-human and human minds have the same nature since they have the same power of reason and will. A little later, she repeats this point and even emphasizes that, I quote, reason is common to human and non-human minds alike. In fact, Crusius claims that, now I quote from Crusius, denn Vernunft haben sie die Tiere nicht, end quote. He explains what he means by reason. Ich verstehe aber unter Vernunft die Kraft, Wahrheit mit Bewusstsein zu erkennen. This means that animals, insofar as they lack consciousness, cannot have reason. So far, this is only a minor point. Yet it will become more important in Dr. Schierbaum's overall assessment of the relationship between Crusius and Wolff's concept of free action. But what does Crusius mean by consciousness? Similar to the 5 external senses, consciousness is said to be some kind of internal sense perception by means of which we perceive that or what is inside our soul. It is by this internal perception that we become aware of our thinking, willing, and perceiving. This probably does not coincidentally remind us of Aristotle's discussion of the perception of perception after presenting the 5 different sense perceptions. However, contrary to Aristotle, Crusius restricts this internal perception to human minds. This does not apply to Wolff. For Wolff, consciousness follows from the clear and distinct discrimination of things. Crusius, on the other hand, takes consciousness as a precondition for this very act of discrimination. He claims that, quote, consciousness as the power of inner sensation is a distinct basic power. At this point of her discussion, Dr. Schierbaum briefly touches upon one of the most problematic and contested features of Crusius' metaphysics, that is his conception of basic or fundamental powers, Grundkräfte. In short, Crusius explains the properties of the mind by introducing distinct fundamental powers. Unsurprisingly, consciousness is taken as a further fundamental power alongside will and understanding. But this gives rise to 2 questions. First, is this indeed a conceptual improvement over Wolff or Leibniz, who claim that simple substances must have only one kind of power due to their simplicity? Second, to what extent does Crusius' conception of consciousness as a fundamental power further influence the philosophical development after Wolff? Of course, especially important would be to see if we can find traces of this idea also in Kant. In the next section, Dr. Schierbaum mentions the medieval debate on higher order accounts of consciousness. I think that this is not only of historical interest to this topic. The two versions of consciousness mentioned in this paper are already indicated by Aristotle's discussion of the perception of perception. Aristotle, as is well known, does not solve the problem of whether perception perceives itself in the act of perception, but presents two alternative accounts, both facing specific problems. According to the first possibility, there must be a sense of its own that perceives the act of perception. Crusius gives us a nice explanation for this assumption. I quote from Crusius: something is added to the action by means of which an object is represented, which is not contained in the representation of the object at all. Accordingly, Crusius distinguishes between two mental states or actions, the perception of the object and the perception of this perception, or just the consciousness of it. Aristotle points out, however, that the second sense, or consciousness, not only perceives the first sense, but also the object of the first sense, which is necessary in order to distinguish the object from the act of perception. But if this is true, one must wonder why the first sense does not already do this, that is, perceive itself and its object. With this in mind, we can now turn the page back to Wolff. For Wolff thinks that one does not have to assume any special power to explain consciousness. Wolff takes from Leibniz the idea that the representations differ in clarity and distinctness. This means that there is only a difference in degree, not in kind, between consciousness and unconscious representations. Dr. Schierbaum, however, expresses his sympathies with Crusius' argument and turns against Wolff. I quote from Schierbaum: "It is difficult to see how the means of representation can be represented itself without yet another act. To answer this worry, let me recall the ancient etymology of representation, that is phantasia, which is derived from the Greek word phos, or light. The Stoics used it for their purposes, as we know from Diogenes Laertius, but also Gassendi and other early modern philosophers refer to this understanding of phantasia, or representation, according to which, just as light illuminates itself and the object, so too does the representation perceive not only its object, but at the same time itself with it." This brings me to my last point. Dr. Schierbaum's conclusion that, I quote, "what matters for Crusius is that this adoption, namely of a person's prevailing desire, presupposes consciousness insofar as the person has to be conscious of her cognitive acts. As I take it, what primarily matters for Crusius is that this choice is, as Dr. Schierbaum puts it only one sentence before, I quote, "is not determined in any way," end quote. I am wondering whether the actual opposition between Wolff and Crusius, and thus the declared goal of Dr. Schierbaum's paper, is not fully stated in this short phrase. After all, Crusius and Wolff emphasize the importance of reason for freedom, which is why for both philosophers only humans and not animals are free. What actually distinguishes them is that for Crusius, as Dr. Schierbaum rightly points out in her conclusion, I quote, "freedom is the power to adopt a desire as action guiding without being determined by one's cognition," end quote. And one should add, this is so because Crusius famously distinguishes between real and cognitive reasons. As it appears to me, Crusius' concept of free action is ultimately based not so much on his concept of consciousness, but on his rejection of the unrestricted and undifferentiated application of the principium rationis sufficientis. Sure. But if this were correct, it would indeed make sense to take at least some aspects of this discussion into account in a paper that focuses primarily on the cognitive features of free action, in order to fully grasp the real opposition between Wolff and Crusius. Thank you, Sonja.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for your rich and really, really good comments. I don't know whether I can really, I mean, I can say something on some points, but I think I have to think about them more, thoroughly. But yes, you're right. So maybe my focus was just too narrow, because I really wanted just to concentrate on this relation between, consciousness and what is reason or understanding. And of course, I mean, the fact that Wolff is committed to the principle of sufficient reason and Crusius rejects it is all, of course, it's important, and maybe I should have, taken that into account more fully, but really I wanted just to focus on that very aspect of consciousness, because I stumbled over that, higher order account in Crusius, and then I started wondering, but wow, I mean, this is interesting. Yes, to your point, you said, I think I wasn't quite clear about, Vernunft and Verstand. And what I meant is that Crusius means that human animals and non-human animals, they have the same nature in that they share this power of Verstand. So in a very broad sense of, okay, you are able to represent things. Okay, and for that it's sufficient that you perceive things. And animals can do that, and we can do that. And in that respect, we have the same nature. I mean, he says that explicitly at some point. But of course, then the difference is that humans are also able to reach this degree of perfection of understanding, which is reason. As you quoted from Crusius, of course, reason is the power to know the truth with consciousness of something. And of course, non-human animals are not able to have reason, but my point was that they're not able to have this higher degree of the understanding, because they lack the power of consciousness. So that's the reason. Yeah, that's a difference. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see that Crusius really, I mean, he says that we share the same nature. I mean, we are all minds, animals and non-human minds, but then he distinguishes between, kinds of minds, but we have the same nature. And then for Wolff, he's quite explicit about that. He says we do not share the same nature. I mean, I had this argument reconstructed, which is not very convincing. I mean, for Wolff, he says, okay, animals and non-humans, they have both the power of representation, understanding, but animals only have clear cognition, and we humans have clear and distinct cognition. And this degree is so different, constitutes then a difference in nature. I mean, he says that explicitly, and I think it's worth, I don't know, it's not very convincing at first view. I mean, we could talk about that. Okay. Yes, and to this, issue of higher order account of consciousness or same order account of consciousness, I mean, things are clear with respect to Crusius. I mean, he's as clear as one can be. It's the same approach that you can find in people like William of Ockham in the 14th century. It's so crystal clear. Yeah, you can only be conscious of your act if you have a higher order act, because it's the issue of objects. An object must be represented by another act. It cannot, the act cannot represent itself. So it's just this kind of approach. And I think my problem with Wolff was that it's less clear. I simply don't understand. Yeah, I mean, it's in the Latin writings, he has this, distinction between perception and apperception. And that seems to indicate, okay, you have a first order cognition and then a second order cognition. But in other writings, he says, no, it's just a matter of distinguishing things. And even animals can do it, right? I mean, whenever I'm talking to you and I'm aware, I perceive that, and at the same time, because I can distinguish between, your face and the nice painting there behind the wall, I can also, I'm also conscious of myself because I distinguish myself from you, and etc. So I simply don't know whether Wolff has a high order account of consciousness or also some kind of same order or some kind of mixture. I simply don't know. It's just less clear. Yes, I mean, I did not mean to express any preferences for one account or the other, but I mean, one thing I appreciate in Crusius is that he's so clear about it. I mean, there's just no doubt what his opinion is. Okay, but there was another point. What was it? I don't know. I think I forgot.
Well, we could.
Yes, please.
If you like, we could open the floor to questions, unless you want to. The last point may come back, and we could come back to Andre Harmon at some point during the discussion as well.
Yeah.
But if you're both happy, thank you very much for this response and the response to the response. Can I encourage people to raise their hand within the chat function if you have a question? There are a couple on my list. I have one in a message. So Lorenzo Sala, if you'd like to ask a question.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I hope my questions aren't due to the fact that my connection doesn't work too well, and so sometimes I wasn't hearing you too clearly.
Oh.
But it seemed to me that at a certain point, you brought together Wolff's account of representation and consciousness and Locke, and even around, because in both cases, you ascribe to them a view of a full transparency of the mind to itself, and also in the end, you seem to argue that for Wolff, all our representing is conscious, because you do this on the grounds of Wolff's definition of cogitatio in the Psychologia Empirica. However, it seems to me that this is extremely problematic, because for Wolff, to think, cogitare is not synonymous with rappresentare, to represent. On the contrary, cogitationes are only a subset of our representationes, and are only those representations which have been the object of an act of a perception. Accordingly, it seems to me that Wolff's account is radically alternative to Locke, in as much as it makes room for a wide number of representations which are unconscious. And this, I mean, I think this is both clear in Wolff and was clear to his contemporaries. For example, if you take Martin, he stresses so much the unconscious aspect of the mind. And the second point concerns what you were, like you quoted that passage about our consciousness of writing and Wolff's distinction between perception and apperception. I don't think that we have to take Wolff as saying that, as having this blurred distinction between perception and apperception, because I think from that passage and the passage around it, it is quite clear that Wolff means that perception of our representations is different from the perception, where in perception we have we have our own representations as an object. This is not the case with apperception, and this is precisely the difference. So where for Wolff consciousness arises through a further representative act, which is a perception, and which is something different from having a perception of our perceptions, this doesn't mean that a perception is the same as perception, because where for Wolff, the acts of a perception do not have our own perception as their intentional objects. Acts of a perception have no intentionality, whereas perception has an intentionality, and this is precisely the difference that we have involved between perception and apperception.
Well, thank you very much. Can I ask you, I mean, this is just, I mean, that just shows that I didn't understand what Wolff means by perceiving one's perception. I mean, what does it mean? So this was just my attempt to understand this, because I thought, okay, you have perception, you have apperception, but what does it mean to perceive one's perception? So could you explain it to me? I mean, I would love to understand this. Just to, yeah.
I mean, I think there's a difference. We can have I don't want to sound too Wolffian, but we have a clear experience of this. One thing is introspection, and one thing is our consciousness of thinking. When I'm thinking, I don't know, it is dark outside, I'm conscious of thinking it is dark outside, but I'm not having a sort of introspection where I have as my object the thought that it is dark outside. So, I mean, that's the difference between perceiving my thought, I think it's dark outside, and perceiving my thought, I think the sky is dark.
Okay, so I must confess that I have always difficulties to understand this, like to perceive something, but without representing then something. And I mean, you say that for Wolff, cogitatio, so to think, is not extensionally the same as to represent something. So you say that. Okay. Yeah.
It is a subset of representaciones.
Okay.
Cogitaciones.
And what other kinds of thinking is there, if not by then representing something? I mean, what do I do when I think without what? I mean, without the content then? Because when I represent something, I think about something. But there must be something I'm thinking about. There must be some content, right? No?
I didn't hear properly the last part. Sorry.
I mean, if there must be some content, right? If I'm thinking, I must be thinking about something, or there must be, well, yes, some content. And I thought that this representation just fills in this content, gives you just the content. I mean, it can be anything. It can be impossible things. It can be whatever. But there has to be some content, right?
Yeah.
Right. And but you would say, I can think without representing something, but there's still some kind of content for Wolff. I'm really asking. I just want to understand Wolff.
I'm asking Stephen if it's all right if I answer again, because I don't want to monopolize the discussion.
Maybe very, very briefly.
Thank you.
I mean,
yeah.
For Wolff, like for many for his contemporaries, like the soul is the mirror of the whole universe. So it continuously represents the complete status of the universe. Right. And sure. But most of these representing is obscure. We have no consciousness of this, and so we have a representation which is contentful, and we do not have any consciousness in the sense of which we have a consciousness when we think it is dark outside, and we do not even have, of course, a perception of these, at least a conscious perception of these. It is just completely unconscious. It might sound really, really weird from our contemporary perspective, but this was the theory.
Yeah, I mean, it's Leibniz, right? The petite perceptions, which are unconscious. Like, yeah,
precisely.
Yeah, right.
Shall we move on to another question, Sonja, if you wanted to add anything to that?
Thanks for your,
Then let's move on to our next question. We may come back to some of these issues. Corey Dyke.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Sonja, for your paper. I'll ask my question, then I'll get out of the way for the rest of the Italians who are waiting to ask questions. All a bunch of hands from Italian folk. Nice to see you. Thanks for your paper. I guess I shared Lorenzo's concern, but on both sides. So my initial reaction was that, wait a minute, I always thought that Wolff was the second order consciousness theorist, and that Crusius was a first order consciousness theorist, and that it's precisely in that respect that Crusius anticipates an important thesis of Kant's, who's also, with respect to original apperception, primitive apperception, is also a kind of first order theorist. At least that's kind of the most interesting part of his theory. And I shared Lorenzo's concerns about the Wolff side of it. I think that thought is something more than what you're talking about. Thought always involves a reflective act, and that's why thought is not. That's why, for instance, matter or bodies is not capable of thought. But on the Crusius side as well, this is the point I wanted to get into here. That I thought that Crusius was a first order theorist, and you said that it was as clear as day that he wasn't. So maybe I'm wrong. That could very well be the case. But the part of the evidence why I think that he is actually in that quote from section 444 of the Entwolf,
Yeah.
that you presented,
Yeah.
which is his objection to Wolff that, well, wait a minute, if consciousness consists in differentiation or distinguishing, however you want to translate Unterscheiden, if consciousness consists in differentiating, well, what are we differentiating? And then Wolff would say, well, we're differentiating, for instance, the object that I'm looking at from myself. And oh, wait a minute, where did that self come in? There must have been some kind of consciousness already of that self, such that I can draw a distinction between it and the thing that I'm perceiving, right? And so Crusius's point precisely against Wolff is that there's already in his account the presupposition of a kind of elemental consciousness of the self, in virtue of which we can distinguish things from me. And so I mean, this is not to say that you're wrong about saying the things you said about Crusius. It's just that I think you have to defend this first order, this characterization of Crusius's account of consciousness in the way that you have from these kinds of objections. And one point that you actually might want to, or one paper you might want to consider is by Jonas Indergaard.
Yeah,
He looks at Crusius on inner sensation. And in fact, I was a referee for that paper, don't tell Jonas. But this was actually something I replied to him in my comments, and we had a kind of an argument in the margins about this. But this is at the very least a controversial, contentious claim that you're making, and I think you have to justify it. And the other quick question that I have, you're welcome to respond to that first one after, but the other quick question I have is just, well, Wolff doesn't distinguish between human minds and animals, as far as I can tell, in terms of the capacity for distinct or clear consciousness, but rather in the explicit passages where he contrasts humans and animals, he distinguishes it in terms of the kind of the content of certain acts of consciousness, and specifically, right, so this discussion of personhood late in the German metaphysics, which I think you referred to also in the discussion of Psychologia Rationalis, in some of your discussions of animals there. But the key distinction for Wolff is not really the capacity for reason or just the capacity for distinct consciousness, but it's the capacity rather for the consciousness of our identity over time that Wolff says distinguishes persons, namely humans and other advanced finite souls or finite minds, from animals who are not capable of that consciousness. Now, Wolff is clear in the rational psychology that in the Psychologia Rationalis, that consciousness, that special kind of consciousness, involves reason, that there's a kind of insight into the connection between two states, right? But that it's not specifically to be identified with reason. And that's important, I think, for when you're transitioning to the practical context, that this is a kind of important notion for, I mean, this has certain practical consequences, certainly for the discussion of immortality, which is why Wolff is talking about it, but probably as well, it's involved in some way in assertions of moral responsibility, attributions, and so forth in this life. And so that distinction, the way that Wolff draws it there between persons and animals, might also be interesting for you to look into as you kind of develop the connection with the discussion of freedom and moral action.
Yeah, thank you very much. So very, very interesting and important. So I might sound stupid, but it really surprises me that Crusius is usually taken to have a first, a same order account of consciousness. Because I mean, the passage I quoted, with the sun and perceiving the sun, and then I have an idea of my idea of the sun. I mean, I think this is really clearly indicates like a high order account of consciousness. And also, I mean, the conditions, I mean, we're not, our perception of something has to be of a certain strength in order to cause this other power to be activated, right? And as I said, I mean, non-human animals, they're perceived, right? I mean, they cannot become conscious of their perception, but surely we would say that they can perceive. And since we share the same nature with animals, then I would think that it would be possible for us just to perceive without being conscious of our perception. Even if, most of the time our perception are so strong that we automatically become conscious of our perceptions. This is just to say that I don't yet see why Crusius should have, as you say, the same order account of consciousness.
I mean, it might be the case that he has both, right?
Maybe
that's
quite
possible.
Maybe.
And this is, some people
Yeah.
argue this with Locke
Sure.
as well, who seems
Sure.
to be a reference point for you, is that Locke
Yeah,
has kind of first order account, and then he has reflection, right? But I mean, to take away the idea of a first order account of consciousness from Crusius would be to take away something fairly significant from him and to put it in Wolff's column. I don't know that folks sympathetic to Crusius would like that. But anyway, it's just to say that there's a reason to think that that Crusius's conception of consciousness might be more robust than what you presented.
Okay. And again, with respect to Wolff, as I said, I think for me at least, things are less clear there. I mean, he seems to have also both, right? Like whenever we distinguish between things, then we are also conscious of self as distinguishing, between these things and ourselves. And it's just not clear to me. It seems, as Lorenzo said, it's not always the case that when we perceive our perception or conscious of our mental states that we have to apperceive it. I mean, there are passages in the Psychologia, which I quoted, right? That he says, whenever there's perception, there's also apperception. So he says that in every cogitatio, there you have both, right? You have perception and apperception. And apperception clearly is, second order, right? Yeah, so maybe Wolff has elements of like both kinds of accounts. I simply don't know. I have to read more about it. I don't know. But it's clear that things are more complicated than I presented them here. So I take that away. that's for sure. Right.
Okay, let's have another question on further complications. Luciano Perulli.
Yep.
Hi, thank you for your paper. I had it's more, let's say, curiosity, or to ask you if you had something to say about the fact that Crusius considers consciousness as a form of inner sensation, and so it as something that has to do with, let's say, sensibility. Of course, it doesn't draw a sharp distinction as one finds in Kant between sensibility and understanding intellectual powers, but still there is this idea that consciousness has to do with Empfindung, and is a form of Empfindung. If I remember correctly, he also characterizes it as a form of passivity, ein Leiden des Verstandes, opposed to other forms that are more active. I mean, there are both sides in consciousness, both an active and a passive side, but let's say it's compared to other forms that are clearly Handlungen, in consciousness there is also this Leiden side. And I was just wondering whether this sensible and passive side of consciousness was something that you thought was relevant, important for your comparison with Wolff, or whether this is something that it's there and it's just irrelevant for the...
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I did not take that into account in my paper, right? But that does not mean that it might be important. Just
no, yeah, it was just an expansion of that.
Yeah. So yes, I must say I cannot. I have to think about it, whether it might be important that there's this passivity, this aspect of passivity and this sensation, or whether it does not matter here with respect to consciousness. I mean, that's a very good question. I didn't take it into account, and it might be important. It might be really important. So
Okay.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The next question is from Henny Blommer.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sonja, for your talk. I have two small questions. One is Leibniz uses also the concept of attention, and yeah, sorry about that. I wonder if this is also taken over by Wolff or not. So attentio.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what is its role in this context? And a second question is, I wonder if in Wolff this kind of confusion where he says, well, the confusion you get with the concepts of perception and apperception. So you mentioned these passages, whenever there's perception, there's also apperception. And this doesn't seem to be parallel with Leibniz theory. But might it be the case that that Wolff was confused by Leibniz use of the terms both apperceive, so apercevoir, and apperception. So it's usually taken to mean the same thing. So the apperception is, let's say, the act apercevoir. But it could be that this is not the case, because apercevoir was normally a word that was used for the same as waarnemen, so to perceive. Whereas apperception was a neologism, was invented by Leibniz, and was specifically meant to point to this kind of reflexive consciousness. And could it be that Wolff didn't grasp, let's say, the different background of both terms and mixed them together, and thought that to apperceive in Leibniz is always meaning there's apperception?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. That could well be. I mean, so your second question, I mean, that Wolff just didn't get it right. I mean, as to the very terms, yeah, possibly. I mean, it could be. And to the question of attention, well, yes, I mean, attention is important for Wolff as well, and for Crusius. And when I was writing the paper, I first focused on attention, because I wanted to relate attention to his Crusius' voluntarist conception of freedom, and wanted to make it like a kind of free action. But in Wolff, then you would have the problem that, of course, for directing the attention, you would also need a sufficient reason. So, but then I might look at that in another paper. So, but yeah, definitely. I mean, he's talking about attention and directing one's attention to things, and sometimes you have the impression that he just confuses things like being conscious of something and to directing one's attention to something, and it's just not clear. Yeah, but it's a good question. I mean, attention is so important also for Crusius, and yes, but yeah, that's all I can say.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Wailamfu.
So thanks, first of all, thank you very much for your very informative paper. And I saw from the title of your talk that it is about Wolff, Crusius, judgment and moral action and the role of consciousness. So actually, I expected more about the moral part of the entire issue. But well, maybe you have already explained it during your talk, but maybe I was just not quite clear about the connection between their respective notion of consciousness with the way we think of morality and our acts. So more specifically, I would like to know whether both of these philosophers claim that it requires a special kind of consciousness in order for us to make a moral judgment and to take a moral action. So the emphasis is really on our way of thinking morally. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, there you really got me, because when I first wrote the abstract, I really wanted to focus on free and moral action. But then in the course of writing, I just got so muddled up in this consciousness business that then I could just say, okay, I'm just looking at the cognitive conditions for free actions, and I just hand waved in the direction, but now I completely left this whole aspect of morality out. But really, I mean, that would be my aim to connect this discussion of consciousness and cognition to the question of what is required for moral action, and is there some moral aspect of consciousness that is required for that or not? Yes, so these are things I wanted to look at, but I didn't get there because I was, stuck in the very beginning, for this cognition business. So that's a very good question, and I will keep that in mind and then work on that further. And I'll let you know.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, sorry.
We have a question. I think there's still time from Tinka Prunet-Brittany.
Yes, hello. Thank you. Thank you for your talk. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So I was wondering, it's not very fresh to me, so I haven't read this text in a while. But I remember that Wolff is talking about a perception mainly in Psychologia Empirica, and he relates it to self-consciousness. Yes, he says something like a soul is conscious of itself insofar it is as it is conscious of its perceptions or something like that. So this is one definition of a perception. But in the Deutsche Metaphysik, he talks about self-consciousness without any appeal to a perception. Do you see what would be the difference between these two treatments of self-consciousness? Yes, in the Deutsche Metaphysik, he relates self-consciousness to distinguishing things. Yes, I'm conscious of myself when I am. So first of all, what would be the distinction between these two treatments of self-consciousness, and why this difference, if ever you see one? And second, how do you understand these two, let's say, acts, yes, of the mind, to distinguish things and to distinguish oneself from the distinguished things? If I got it right, perhaps Corey said something about the priority of self-consciousness, and I'm not sure it's the case. I think that Wolff, so the fact that being self-conscious, of being conscious of oneself, is not prior to distinguishing things, into my understanding, but perhaps I'm wrong. So these would be the 2 points.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, this is just what I was asking myself. I mean, the Deutsche Metaphysik, Deutsche Metaphysik is earlier, right? And there the distinction between perception and apperception does not show up. But in the later Latin writings, it shows up. So I can't tell you why. I mean, I wish I knew, right? But still, I mean, you could still think that it's still compatible, these two accounts, if we say that in the Deutsche Metaphysik, whenever you distinguish between, you perceive something and then you distinguish clearly between these things, and thereby you somehow become conscious of yourself because you also distinguish yourself from these things. And why not say that in that case you also, I don't know. I mean, it's just an open question whether this becoming conscious of oneself, whether that is a first order act or a second order act. I mean, it could be a perception maybe, when you become aware of your perceiving things, but it could well be, on the first order level. I just don't know. I mean, Wolff is not explicit about this, but I mean, you could argue perhaps these two accounts are somehow consistent, compatible, and maybe not. I mean, he does not, by introducing the distinction between perception and apperception, he does not need to abandon his account of consciousness as distinguishing between things. I mean, these two things could go together, right? I mean, there's no reason why that should not be possible. So the problem is that he's not explicit about this. I mean, he does not explain why he sees, the need later to make that distinction. Maybe he simply follows Leibniz for some reason. I'm sorry, I can't tell you. I can't tell you why.
Okay, well, if everybody agrees, I suggest that we run over by just a few minutes, just so that I can give the one final question to Karen de Boer.
Okay.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Sonja, for your paper. I was particularly struck by one remark you made on Crusius and the passage you showed on the idea of the sun and how we produce, as it were, the object of the idea of the sun. Mm-hmm. And I was struck by the fact that Crusius uses the term object with a C, so not Gegenstand and not object with a K. Mm-hmm. But I also was wondering whether Crusius has this idea that consciousness or being conscious of something means producing something as an object. Yeah, so that sounds a bit Kantian, at least to my mind. But so we've been talking a lot about self-consciousness and apperception and so on. But I had the impression that in Crusius there's also something, an idea about what it means to cognize an object, and that cognizing an object or positing something as an object involves a particular type of maybe second order cognition or consciousness. You see what I mean? So it is, according to Crusius, consciousness an act that is required to produce something as an object.
That sounds really Kantian.
Yes, but I wanted to check. Yes, maybe it's. But I somehow had the impression. Yeah. Because I was struck by the way that Crusius used the term object. Yes, because I sometimes think that this is one of Kant's innovative steps, focusing on the question, what does it take to produce an object? But I had the impression that this is also something that Crusius addresses, but maybe he does so in a way that that is way more traditional. Yeah, so I can't really tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he's pretty traditional in that respect. I mean, he's talking about what does it mean to perceive something, have a cognition of it while you represent it. Okay, you have like an act of perception, and what does this act? It gives you, it represents an object. But that object is something external, like the sun in this case, right? So I think there's just some, efficient causality at play here. Like the sun causes an act of perception, and that perception then represents the sun to you, because that's the object of the mental act. So as far as I understand Crusius, it's quite traditional. Like it sounds very medieval. In fact, like this mental representation, like it's a causal business. Like you have external objects, and they cause acts of perception, and then they're represented by these acts. So yes, I think Crusius is quite traditional in that respect, but I might be wrong. But maybe other people have other thoughts about that. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. We should finish there, but before we do, I just want to mention the next two upcoming events in our series. On December the 10th, we have the launch of the book Hegel's Concept of Life by Karin Ing from Vanderbilt University with a range of speakers. And on December the 17th, Joel Klein, who is talking about Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena. So I think now, thank you all very much for your comments, and please join me in thanking our speakers, Sonja Schierbaum and Andrea Harmon.